The number didn't feel real, yet it was the only thing in the room that possessed any weight. $1,200,000,000. Harrison Caldwell leaned back in his ergonomic throne, his silhouette cast against the floor-to-ceiling glass of his corner office in Canary Wharf. The London skyline was a muted tapestry of charcoal greys and rain-slicked silver, but the reflection in the glass was crystal clear. The acquisition term sheet from Orion Systems was projected there, glowing with a clinical, white light that seemed to bleach the very air. HelixLayer had started as a frantic experiment in a windowless basement, a desperate attempt to solve the latency tax of modern AI. Harrison had envisioned a system that didn't just process data, but choreographed it, splitting massive inference workloads across a global web of edge nodes. It was a digital ballet, and now, it was the most sought-after orchestration layer in the world. And Orion Systems, the apex predator of the tech sector, wanted to swallow it whole. Behind him, the soft click of a door latch announced Sebastian Hollister. Sebastian didn't move like a CFO, he moved like an assassin, silent and precise. He had been there since the beginning, the steady hand to Harrison's volatile genius. "They are undervaluing us," Sebastian said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that lacked the celebratory tremor one might expect for a billion-dollar day. Harrison didn't turn. He watched Sebastian's reflection in the glass. "They're buying control, Sebastian. Not just the tech. Control has a premium, and Orion thinks they found the ceiling." Sebastian stepped into the light of the projection, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of the spreadsheets. "Clause 7.2, he muttered, eyes scanning the digital ink. "Change of control payouts." Harrison already knew the numbers by heart. He had lived inside them for weeks. "Say it," Harrison commanded, his voice cold. Sebastian's jaw tightened, a small muscle pulsing near his ear. On the current cap table, with the accelerated vesting triggered by the Orion exit, you take 400 million. "And you?" Harrison asked, finally swiveling his chair to face his partner. "Less than half," Sebastian replied. "Significantly less." The silence that followed was heavy, a physical pressure in the room. In the early days, they had been brothers in arms, sharing cold pizza and lines of code. But cap tables weren't spreadsheets, they were chronicles of shifting loyalty. They were weapons. Sebastian had built HelixLayer's financial structure from the ground up. He had navigated the treacherous waters of seed rounds, convertible notes, and the emergency dilution shields of the Series B. He knew every decimal point of ownership. He was the one who ensured the blood stayed inside the body of the company. Which is why he had noticed the discrepancy. Buried deep within the Series B adjustment ledger, a document so dense it acted as a deterrent to most auditors, was a recalibration entry. It was time-stamped during the chaotic 48 hours of their last funding round, a time when the company was weeks away from insolvency. It had been authorized by Harrison alone, tucked under a clause titled Executive Recalibration Permitted Under Conditions of Emergency Dilution Protection. To a casual observer, it looked like a standard administrative cleanup. But to Sebastian, who understood the underlying math like a second language, the truth was naked. Harrison had quietly increased his personal stake by 6.8%. At the $1.2 billion valuation, that single, silent maneuver translated to $81.6 million. Sebastian said nothing about the discovery. He didn't scream, and he didn't demand an explanation. He simply stood there in the glow of the term sheet, his mind recalculating the value of his own years of loyalty. In that moment, the friendship died, replaced by a cold, mathematical realization. Harrison viewed him as a component, not a partner. "The Orion due diligence team arrives tomorrow," Harrison said, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the shift in his friend's psyche. "I want the data room scrubbed and locked. No loose ends." I'll handle the financial forensics, Sebastian said, his voice regaining its practiced neutrality. You handle the technical walkthroughs. The following days were a blur of high-stakes scrutiny. The Orion team arrived like a swarm of locusts, legal auditors, cybersecurity analysts, and AI ethics reviewers. They occupied the conference rooms, fueled by expensive espresso and a predatory instinct for weakness. Every line of HelixLayer's code was scanned. Every vendor contract was parsed for hidden liabilities. Harrison walked them through the architecture, the Kubernetes-based orchestration, the custom AI scheduler they called HelixCore, and the federated model training pipelines that gave the system its speed. But as the auditors dug, a single anomaly surfaced. A cluster. It was unregistered, running outside the declared production infrastructure, drawing a consistent but quiet amount of compute power. An Orion analyst flagged it during a morning sync. We're seeing a shadow node, Mr. Caldwell. It's not in the architectural diagrams. Harrison didn't blink. Experimental, he said, his tone dismissive. A sandbox for the next-gen inference testing. It's walled off from the core IP. It's not part of the sale. Sebastian, sitting at the end of the table, watched Harrison's eyes. He knew that look. It wasn't the look of a man talking about a sandbox. It was the look of a man guarding a secret. Sebastian had flagged that same cluster weeks ago, and Harrison had given him the same brush-off. Money alone wasn't the reason Sebastian's resentment was turning into something more kinetic. It was the lack of respect. Sebastian had built the company's financial backbone, creating the stability that allowed Harrison to be the visionary. Harrison was the face, the speaker, the one the investors trusted with their billions. Sebastian was merely necessary. Harrison was irreplaceable. That distinction defined everything. Late that night, Sebastian sat alone in the darkened office, the city lights shimmering like fallen jewels below. He opened a private terminal and accessed the legal archives of the merger. He wasn't looking at the money anymore. He was looking at the fine print of the transition. He found it. Clause 11.4. He read it 5 times, the words searing into his brain. In the event of incapacitation or death of a primary executive prior to closing, equity redistribution shall default to surviving executive leadership unless otherwise specified in binding addendum. Sebastian searched the directory. No addendum existed. The realization didn't shock him, it clarified the world. If Harrison died before the ink on the Orion deal was dry, the recalibrated equity, the $400 million, the extra $81 million, the entire controlling interest, would fall into Sebastian's lap. His total payout would exceed $700 million. Sebastian was a meticulous man. He didn't act on impulse, and he didn't believe in luck. He believed in systems. And systems, he knew, could be engineered toward a specific outcome. He opened an encrypted browser, routing his connection through a series of offshore shell entities in Estonia and Singapore. He began a procurement process that had nothing to do with software or AI. He was looking for a very specific type of tool, a synthetic protein inhibitor, modeled after ricin, but refined for modern precision. It was untraceable in microdoses, possessed a delayed onset, and metabolized so cleanly that any autopsy would point to a simple, tragic cardiac failure. As the sun began to rise over the Thames, Sebastian didn't feel like a murderer. He felt like an auditor. He was simply correcting a discrepancy in the ledger. The surveillance of intent, the high-velocity air of the HelixLayer server room was a constant, 60-degree gale. Harrison Caldwell stood amidst the humming black monoliths, his face illuminated by the rhythmic blinking of blue and amber LEDs. To the outside world, this was just infrastructure. To Harrison, it was a sensory organ. He wasn't looking at the cooling manifold. He was looking at a private terminal tethered to the experimental cluster Sebastian had flagged. Harrison didn't trust anomalies because, in his world, an anomaly was either a precursor to a system crash or a signature of a breach. He had spent the last 72 hours repurposing HelixLayer's internal AI, originally designed to detect packet-level network irregularities, to monitor a far more volatile system, human behavior. He fed the engine everything. He pulled the financial access logs from the secure vault. He scraped the metadata from the office's internal Wi-Fi mesh, tracking movement patterns. He even pulled the encrypted procurement requests Sebastian had routed through the Singapore shell companies. Sebastian was good, meticulous, even, but he had forgotten that every digital shadow leaves a thermal footprint in the logs if you know where to look. "Show me the outliers," Harrison whispered. The screen shifted. A series of data points coalesced into a heat map. Asterisk financial logs. Sebastian had accessed the incapacitation clause 11.46 times in the last 48 hours. Asterisk movement. Sebastian had stayed late, but his keystroke cadence, measured by the smart switches in his office, didn't match financial modeling. It matched research. Asterisk procurement. A series of microtransactions, disguised as cloud egress fees, had been funneled to a biotech research firm in Estonia. Harrison leaned forward, his reflection in the terminal glass looking older, sharper. "Interesting," he murmured. He didn't feel the sting of betrayal. Instead, he felt a clinical, almost academic curiosity. He had built a predictive behavioral model. He treated Sebastian like a failing node in a distributed network. He began inputting variables, typing speed, calendar shifts, and biometric stress indicators harvested from the subtle sensors embedded in the boardroom chairs. The AI spat out a result. Hostile intent probability, 62.4% projected timeline of action. 72 hours. Harrison stayed in the cold room for another hour, his mind spinning through the logic. He wasn't going to confront Sebastian. A confrontation was a binary event. It led to a mess, a legal battle, and the potential collapse of the Orion deal. He needed a more elegant solution. He needed to let the system run its course, but with a modified set of inputs. He began by altering his own wearable biometric device, the sleek, titanium ring he wore to track his sleep and heart rate. He injected a synthetic telemetry loop into the local sync app. If his heart stopped, the ring would continue to broadcast a perfect 6 to 5 beat per minute rhythm to the office's central health monitoring hub. To the world, he would be a ghost that refused to leave the machine. But that was defensive. He needed an offensive pivot. The next morning, the tension in the executive suite was palpable, though hidden behind a veneer of corporate efficiency. Sebastian entered Harrison's office with 2 cups of coffee. "Orion wants a final sign-off on the IP transfer at the dinner tonight," Sebastian said, placing a cup on Harrison's desk. His hand was steady, his eyes clear. Harrison looked at the coffee. He looked at Sebastian. "You've been working too hard, Seb. You're looking thin." "It's the deal," Sebastian replied, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. $1 billion is a lot of weight to carry." "It is," Harrison agreed. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to Sebastian. "I've been thinking about the recalibrations we made during the Series B. I know you saw the ledger entries." He heard the slight catch in Sebastian's breath. "A microstutter in the system." "I saw them," Sebastian said quietly. "I did it to protect the company," Harrison lied, his voice sounding convincingly weary. "I needed a majority that couldn't be broken by the VCs if things went south. But after the Orion deal closes, I was planning on an off-market transfer to bring us back to parity. It was a brilliant piece of social engineering." He was offering Sebastian a patch, a reason to stand down. He watched Sebastian's reflection. For a moment, he saw hesitation. Then the coldness returned. Sebastian didn't believe him. And why should he? In a world governed by Clause 11.4, a promise was just uncompiled code. I appreciate that, Harrison, Sebastian said. Truly. As Sebastian left the room, Harrison didn't touch the coffee. He waited until the door clicked shut, then poured the liquid into a sample vial he had hidden in his desk. He would test it later, but he already knew. He began subtly altering his routines. During their lunch meeting with the Orion legal team, he switched drinks mid-conversation, claiming he had grabbed the wrong sparkling water. At the afternoon briefing, he encouraged shared plates, physically moving the food around with a jovial, high-energy persona that felt entirely alien to his usual stoicism. He was creating noise. He was making it impossible for Sebastian to be certain of the delivery. By 4 p.m., the behavioral model updated. Hostile intent probability, 88.1%. Sebastian was no longer just considering the act, he was committed to it. Harrison could see it in the way Sebastian checked his watch, a rhythmic, obsessive tick. Sebastian believed he had already won. He believed that the poison, likely hidden in a cufflink or a pen, was the final line of code that would execute the transfer of power. Harrison sat at his desk and opened the final merger documents. He looked at the signature fields. If he died after signing, the money went to Sebastian. If he died before, the deal would likely collapse into a legal quagmire. Sebastian needed him to sign, and then he needed him to disappear. Harrison felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the ultimate high-stakes debugging. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the integrity of his architecture. He began to write a private memo, encrypted with a one-time pad that lived only in his mind. Subject: System integrity in complex systems. Failure is rarely random. It is engineered, anticipated, or ignored. He stopped. He could hear the Orion team laughing in the hallway, the sound of champagne corks popping in anticipation of the closing dinner. He looked at his titanium ring, the blue light of the heartbeat sensor flickering against his skin. He had mapped out every contingency. He had analyzed the legal, the technical, and the biochemical. Let's see who's the better architect, Harrison whispered to the empty room. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the elevator. The closing dinner was at the Gilded Cage, a private club where the walls were soundproof and the staff was trained in the art of invisible service. It was the perfect place for a celebration, and the perfect place for an execution. As the elevator descended, Harrison felt a strange sense of peace. He had moved beyond fear. He was now just a series of functions, waiting for the trigger. He watched the floor numbers count down, 10, 9, 8. He reached into his pocket and touched a small, transparent patch on his forearm, hidden beneath his shirt sleeve. An antagonist. A safety net. The doors opened. Sebastian was waiting in the lobby, his coat on, looking like the picture of executive success. Ready? Sebastian asked. Always, Harrison replied. The architecture of Betrayal Act 3, the friction of the Feast the Gilded Cage lived up to its name. Located in a subterranean vault that had once held the bullion of a fallen empire, the private dining room was a masterclass in oppressive luxury. The walls were lined with vertical gardens of deep purple orchids, and the table was a single, massive slab of obsidian polished to a mirror finish. Harrison sat at the head of the table, the Orion CEO, a silver-haired shark named Miller, to his right. Sebastian sat directly across from Harrison. Between them lay the final physical copies of the acquisition agreement, bound in leather and smelling of fresh ink and ambition. To the future, Miller toasted, raising a crystal glass of 1945 Rothschild. to a world where latency is a myth and HelixLayer is the heartbeat. Harrison raised his glass, catching Sebastian's eye. The CFO's expression was a study in practiced composure, but Harrison's internal model was screaming. He didn't need the AI anymore. He could see the physical tells. Sebastian's breathing was shallow, his carotid artery pulsing visibly against the starch of his collar. To the future, Harrison echoed. He took a sip, the wine tasting of blackberries and iron. He felt the synthetic patch on his forearm, a transdermal delivery system of a broad-spectrum metabolic buffer he'd sourced through his own back channels. It wasn't a perfect shield, but it was a stabilizer. It was the digital equivalent of a redundant power supply. The dinner progressed with the agonizing slow motion of a car crash in progress. While Miller droned on about market integration and post-merger synergy, the real war was being fought in the inches of space between the plates. Sebastian was waiting for the moment. Harrison knew the compound Sebastian had procured was designed for oral ingestion. It was the most natural way to trigger a cardiac event. It required a delivery window. It came during the transition from the main course to dessert. The waitstaff, moving with ghostly efficiency, cleared the table. For a few seconds, the room was a blur of motion. Harrison leaned back, laughing at one of Miller's anecdotes. He reached for his water glass, but accidentally knocked his dessert fork onto the floor. As he bent down to retrieve it, a maneuver that took exactly 4 seconds, he watched the reflection in the obsidian table. Sebastian's hand moved. It was a blur of practiced motion. A cufflink clicked open. A microscopic spray, directed not into Harrison's wine, but into his half-full glass of sparkling water. Harrison straightened up, the fork back on the table. He didn't look at his water. He looked at Sebastian, who was now calmly wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "You okay, Harrison?" Sebastian asked. The voice was perfect. Concerned. Loyal. "Fine," Harrison said. "Just a bit of vertigo. The scale of the day, I suppose." "It's a lot to process," Miller added, pushing the signature page toward Harrison. "Why don't we put the ink on paper? Make it official before the cognac hits." Harrison picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. This was the pivot point. If he signed, that incapacitation clause became active. If he drank the water after signing, the system would execute exactly as Sebastian had designed. Harrison looked at the signature line. He felt the weight of the $1.2 billion. He felt the weight of the betrayal. He thought about the Series B recalibration, the $81 million he had stolen from the pool. He realized then that he and Sebastian were the same. They were both architects of hidden layers. He signed. The ink was thick and black. Then he pushed the document to Sebastian. "Your turn, partner. The CFO needs to attest to the solvency of the transition." Sebastian took the pen. His hand didn't shake. He signed his name with a flourish, the final stroke of the R cutting deep into the paper. "Done," Miller whispered, a predatory grin spreading across his face. The room erupted in a small, polite round of applause from the legal teams at the far end of the table. The Orion team began pouring the celebratory cognac, a vintage so rare it was kept in a humidor. "A toast," Sebastian said, standing up. He picked up his own wine glass. Sebastian lunged at him, but his knees buckled. The compound was fast, but not that fast. The weakness he felt was purely psychological, the sudden, crushing weight of certain death. "You're bluffing," Sebastian hissed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're trying to scare me into a confession." "I don't need a confession," Harrison said. "I have the logs. And soon, I'll have your equity." Harrison turned and walked toward the waiting black sedan. He didn't look back. Behind him, He heard Sebastian collapse into a sitting position on the wet pavement. Harrison! Sebastian screamed. Harrison closed the car door. Drive, he told the chauffeur. As the car pulled away, Harrison looked at his phone. The behavioral model was no longer predicting intent. It was monitoring a result. Subject status, compromised system state. Transitioning, he had 48 hours to prepare for the fallout. He had 48 hours to become the sole survivor of HelixLayer. The silence of Harrison's penthouse was absolute, a stark contrast to the thrumming adrenaline of the vault. He stood at the center of his living room, stripping off his tuxedo jacket as if it were a layer of contaminated skin. He didn't turn on the lights. The ambient glow of London, a rhythmic pulsing of red aviation lights and blue-white street lamps, was enough to navigate the shadows. He checked his wrist. The titanium ring pulsed a steady, rhythmic blue. On his primary monitor, a dashboard showed the heartbeat of the company. It was 1:42 a.m. The Orion acquisition was officially in flight, a digital ghost ship moving through the legal ether toward completion. But beneath the surface of the corporate merger, a far more delicate operation was underway. Harrison sat at his terminal and opened a secure shell. He wasn't looking for financial data now. He was monitoring Sebastian. Earlier that night, as Sebastian had stumbled out of the club, Harrison had deployed a final, invisible tether. He had authorized an emergency update to Sebastian's corporate mobile device, a background process that mirrored the phone's biometric health data to Harrison's private server. Subject: S. Hollister heart rate, 94 BPM, elevated, respiration, 22 BPM, blood oxygen, 98%. The compound was a masterpiece of delayed onset. It didn't attack the heart directly at first. It began by subtly inhibiting the protein synthesis required for electrical signaling in the sinoatrial node. It was a slow-motion glitch in the body's clock. For the next 24 hours, Sebastian would feel nothing more than a mild, lingering anxiety, something easily attributed to the stress of a billion-dollar exit. "He'll think I was bluffing," Harrison whispered. He knew Sebastian's mind. Sebastian would wake up tomorrow morning, see the sun, feel his pulse, and convince himself that Harrison's switch had been a psychological gambit, the desperate attempt to rattle him. Sebastian would return to the office to finish the paperwork, fueled by a renewed, vengeful energy. That was exactly what Harrison needed. If Sebastian died tonight, the incapacitation clause would trigger before the final regulatory stamps were dry, potentially inviting a deeper forensic audit. But if Sebastian stayed alive in the eyes of the system until the final wire transfer. Harrison opened the Helix core source code. He navigated to the section Sebastian had flagged weeks ago, the unregistered cluster. It wasn't an experimental sandbox. It was a mirror. Harrison had spent months building a digital twin of Sebastian's entire professional existence. He had used the behavioral data, the email archives, the voice memos, and the typing cadences to train a narrow-focus LLM. Its only purpose was to be Sebastian Hollister. He initiated the pulse loop, initializing biometric simulation, syncing with S, Hollister baseline. Status active. Now, even if Sebastian's physical heart stopped, the corporate network and the biometric security layers of the Orion merger would continue to receive a live signal from Sebastian's credentials. To the world, Sebastian would be typing, signing, and breathing for as long as Harrison kept the servers running. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. A secure message from Miller, the Orion CEO. Miller, documents received by escrow. Regulatory, green light, expected in 36 hours. Congratulations, Harrison. You and Sebastian made history. Harrison didn't reply. He watched the biometric feed. Heart rate 82 bpm. Subject likely sleeping. Harrison didn't sleep. He spent the night in the Situation Room, a small, windowless den filled with monitors. He was a general watching a battlefield where the only soldier left was a ghost. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the office was a hive of activity. Harrison walked through the glass-walled corridors, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He looked perfectly composed. He saw Sebastian through the window of the CFO's suite. Sebastian looked pale, his movements slightly sluggish, but he was there. He was working. When their eyes met, Sebastian's expression was one of pure, distilled hatred, but he didn't move. He didn't scream. He was waiting. He was checking his own pulse, wondering if the ticking clock in his chest was real or a phantom. Harrison entered his office and closed the door. He opened the kill switch directory. This was the most dangerous part of the architecture. Sebastian was no amateur. He had built a dead man's switch into the HelixLayer infrastructure. If Sebastian's biometric signature ceased, or if he was locked out of the system, a packet of poison pill data would be released to Orion's legal team. It contained the evidence of Harrison's $81 million manipulation. Harrison had found the trigger weeks ago. He had spent nights debating whether to delete it. But deleting it would leave a hole in the logs, a signature of tampering. Instead, he had rewritten the input. He had rerouted the dead man's switch to look at the pulse loop he had created, rather than Sebastian's actual body. As long as the simulation was running, the poison pill would stay in its digital silo. The morning turned into a grueling afternoon of final meetings. Harrison and Sebastian sat in the same boardroom, separated by 6 feet of mahogany and a lifetime of betrayal. "The funds are staged in the Singapore holding account," Miller said over the speakerphone. "We are just waiting for the final attestation from the CFO. Sebastian, if you could just provide the biometric sign-off on the liquidity schedule, we can close the book." Sebastian reached for the tablet on the table. His hand trembled, just a fraction. He looked at Harrison, a silent question in his eyes. "Is this the moment I die?" Harrison offered a small, encouraging nod. "Do it, Seb. Let's finish what we started." Sebastian pressed his thumb to the sensor. The screen glowed green. Authentication successful. Funds released. In that moment, the $1.2 billion moved. It shattered into 1,000 different streams, flowing into the accounts of investors, employees, and, mostly, Harrison Caldwell. Sebastian slumped back in his chair, a look of profound relief washing over his face. He was still breathing. The sun was still shining. He had signed the deal, he was rich, and Harrison's threat had seemingly vanished into the ether. "I'm going home," Sebastian said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I'm done." "You certainly are," Harrison replied. Sebastian stood up, but as he reached for the door handle, he stopped. He gripped his chest, his face contorting into a mask of sudden, sharp confusion. It wasn't the dramatic collapse of a movie, it was a quiet, internal shattering. "Harrison." He gasped. Harrison didn't move. He watched as Sebastian's knees gave way. The CFO slid down the glass door, his eyes locked on Harrison's. "The latency," Harrison said softly, walking over to him. "It's the one thing you always underestimated, Sebastian. The time between the command and the execution." Sebastian tried to speak, but his coordination was gone. His heart had entered a state of terminal fibrillation. Harrison knelt down, but not to help. He reached out and gently took Sebastian's corporate phone from his pocket. He looked at the screen. Subject status, critical. Heart rate, 180 BPM. 210 BPM. 0 BPM. Sebastian Hollister was dead. Harrison stood up. He didn't call for help. He didn't panic. He walked back to his desk and checked the server logs. The dead man's switch remained dormant. The pulse loop was picking up the slack, broadcasting a steady, healthy heartbeat from Sebastian's credentials. To the Orion network, the CFO was currently active and likely browsing the post-merger integration docs. Harrison waited. He watched the clock. He waited exactly 10 minutes, the time it would take for a casual observer to notice someone had collapsed in the hallway. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and let out a sharp, practice cry for help. Security. Medical. Something's wrong with Sebastian. The office erupted into chaos. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their boots thudding on the expensive carpet. They performed CPR, they used the defibrillator, they shouted orders. Harrison stood in the corner, the picture of a devastated friend. He watched them wheel Sebastian's body away. He saw the sorrow on the faces of the staff. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A notification from the pulse loop. Simulation status, stable. Biometric feed, 72 BPM, simulated. The ghost was now in control of the calendar. The transition was complete. The funeral was a masterpiece of corporate theatre. It was held at a cathedral that felt more like a museum of old money than a house of worship. The pews were filled with the elite of the tech world, men and women in charcoal, wool and silk, their faces set in expressions of practiced, somber respect. Miller, the Orion CEO, delivered a eulogy that described Sebastian as a titan of fiscal integrity and a visionary architect of the modern exit. Harrison sat in the front row, his hands folded in his lap. He wore a black suit tailored so sharply it looked like armor. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. He simply stared at the mahogany casket, his mind focused on the data stream currently pulsing through the titanium ring on his finger. Inside the casket, Sebastian was a cold, biological fact. But on the servers of HelixLayer, now fully integrated into the Orion mainframe, Sebastian Hollister was still very much alive. Status: active current activity, reviewing post-merger tax compliance, automated, heart rate, 68 BPM, simulated. The pulse loop was a perfect loop. It used Sebastian's historical habits to mimic life. Every morning at 8:45 a.m., Sebastian's credentials logged in from his home IP address, a VPN Harrison had established months ago. The simulation sent 3 to 5 mundane emails a day, acknowledged, looping in the legal team, looks good for Q3. It even occasionally liked industry posts on LinkedIn. To the world, Sebastian Hollister hadn't died of a heart attack in the hallway. He had simply become a recluse. The official narrative, whispered in the boardrooms, was that the stress of the $1.2 billion deal had broken him. He had retired immediately following the wire transfer, retreating to a private estate in the Swiss Alps to recover. It was a lie, but it was a lie the system accepted because the data supported it. 3 months later, Harrison stood in his new office, the top floor of the Orion Tower in Manhattan. The air was thinner here, the view more expansive. He was no longer just the founder of HelixLayer. He was the chief technology officer of Orion Systems, overseeing a global empire of distributed intelligence. A soft chime echoed through the room. It was the audit alert he had set for the pulse loop. The final regulatory clearance from the SEC was due this afternoon. This was the last hurdle. Once the certificate of finality was issued, the escrowed funds, including the $81 million Harrison had skimmed, would be permanently released. He sat at his desk and opened the biometric dashboard. Warning: input discrepancy detected. Harrison's heart skipped a beat, a real one. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The simulation was flagging a conflict. Someone was trying to log in as Sebastian. Not the VPN. Not the automated script. A physical attempt at a terminal within the Orion building. Harrison's fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the request. It was coming from the basement, the high-security forensics lab. He felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. Had he missed a signature? Had the dead man's switch found a way to bypass the pulse loop? He pulled up the security camera feed for Lab 4. On the screen, a young woman in a white lab coat sat at a terminal. She was an Orion cybersecurity auditor, one of the efficiency experts Marcus had mentioned a lifetime ago. She had Sebastian's old corporate laptop, the one the paramedics had left behind in the chaos. She wasn't trying to hack the system. She was performing a routine hardware decommissioning. But as she wiped the drive, she had triggered a low-level BIOS alert. Verification required. Biometric key 0x8891 Thorn private. Harrison froze. Thorn. The name hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't thought about Elias Thorn in years. Thorn was the developer from the startup days, the one who had built the original scheduling module, Kronos, that HelixLayer had been built upon. Harrison realized with a sickening clarity that he had made a fundamental architectural error. He had spent so much time simulating Sebastian that he had forgotten the foundation the simulation was built on. Sebastian hadn't just used HelixLayer's logic for his dead man's switch, he had buried it inside the legacy code of Kronos. The auditor on the screen reached for her desk phone. She was going to call her supervisor. Harrison didn't hesitate. He opened the pulse loop command console. He had two choices: let her make the call and risk an investigation that would lead to his doorstep, or execute the final system purge. The purge would delete everything. It would kill the pulse loop, silence the ghost of Sebastian, and wipe every trace of the $81 million manipulation. But it would also crash the Orion integration. It would trigger a global system down for every logistics hub, every ship, and every truck running on Helix core. It was a $1.2 billion suicide note. Harrison looked at the finalize button. He thought about Sebastian's eyes as he slid down the glass door. He thought about the $400 million already sitting in his private accounts. He was an architect. And sometimes, the only way to save the structure is to burn the foundation. He clicked. System command, purge all layers. Are you sure? Why across the world, the lights of the Orion Empire flickered. In the Singapore hub, the crane stopped moving. In the North Atlantic, 3 container ships lost their navigational synchronization. In the Manhattan office, the auditor's screen went black. Harrison leaned back in his chair. He watched the system failure alerts blossom across his monitors like digital wildfires. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. The ghost was finally gone. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the elevator. He didn't take his laptop. He didn't take his files. He only took the titanium ring. As he reached the lobby, the building was in a state of controlled panic. Security guards were running toward the server rooms. Executives were shouting into phones that no longer had a signal. Harrison walked out the front doors and into the bright, indifferent light of a New York afternoon. He started walking. He didn't have a destination, but for the first time in a decade, he wasn't being tracked by a ledger. 6 months later, Harrison sat on a beach in a country that didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. He was drinking a cheap beer, his skin turned a deep, weathered brown. On the table in front of him was a crumpled copy of a financial newspaper. The headline read, Orion Systems files for bankruptcy following catastrophic logic failure. The article detailed the mystery of the Hollister glitch a sequence of code that had seemingly deleted the company's entire operational history in a matter of seconds. Federal investigators were still searching for Harrison Caldwell, the visionary CTO who had vanished the day the world stopped moving. Harrison looked out at the ocean. He thought about the memo he had written. In complex systems, failure is rarely random. It is engineered, anticipated, or ignored. He realized he had been wrong about one thing. He hadn't been the architect of Sebastian's death or the architect of Orion's collapse. He had just been a component in a much larger, much older system. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the titanium ring. He looked at the heartbeat sensor. It was dark. No blue light. No pulse. He tossed the ring into the surf. It disappeared instantly, swallowed by the infinite, rhythmic logic of the tide. Harrison took a sip of his beer. The world was broken, but the system was finally balanced. No discrepancies. No pending transfers. Just the sun, the sand, and the silence of a completed execution. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in his life, he didn't dream in code.